Ubisoft is the most anti-consumerist publisher in all of gaming, and that is at its most apparent in the Assassin's Creed series, a franchise that over the last several years has declined considerably, in no small part because of the ways that Ubisoft choose to monetize their content, intrusively, dishonestly, and at the cost of the quality of these games that you no longer truly own. They've managed to breed complacency and anti-consumerist practice in a sly, gradual shift towards unabated greed, and that's the reason why Assassin's Creed is in the state that it is today, because these scummy practices have crept in and developed slowly with every game and every recession of industry expectations. So before we look to the bleak present, which we will do, I'd like to go through a sort of microtransaction timeline here. The first time that Assassin's Creed ever dipped its toe in the sea of microtransactions was back in 2013 with Black Flag, at least for single player, which is what I'll be focusing on here because for the sake of this video, that's all that really matters. In single player, you could buy sails, weapons, figureheads, wheels, etc. Although all of these are included within the Season Pass, so if you buy that, you're not really missing out on anything. What the Season Pass does exclude though, naturally, are time savers that reveal the locations of activities and treasures. There's ones that remove the need for blueprints to access upgrades, there's one that grants you resources, it's all the typical stuff. Now my issue with time savers is that the very principle of them is trying to appeal to you by getting you to play less of a game that you've already bought. And in the case of Black Flag, I really don't want to excise these big chunks of progression and exploration because I enjoy them, and that's a good thing. I shouldn't want to buy time savers. To make them appealing, you need to make progression unappealing, which makes them kind of baffling here because getting resources or going diving for blueprints is a lot of fun, which is ultimately why I don't really find them too pernicious here, even if it was kind of a pretty poor precedent, because I don't really feel like the game has been impaired to sell them. Unity the next year is where things do start to get intrusive, with the introduction of Helix credits. Now, the very existence of a secondary currency, which in this case is just real fucking money, let's be honest, there is no other way of getting these that isn't paying up real cash, it's insane. Currencies like these are acceptable in moderation in free-to-play games where the developers have no other choice if they want to make their money back on development costs, employee salaries, before even getting into profits. But in a single player game, which is starting to cost like £70 for a standard edition, it's hard not to feel trepidation around these middlemen currencies like Helix that are only accessible with real money and can only sell and truly function if there is some kind of dysfunction in the consumer-friendly currency, whose only real sort of entry fee is the game itself, and you can see that at play in Unity. This is the first game whose design feels as if it's been tampered with by microtransactions. Unity's entire customization system is designed in hopes that you will buy Helix credits. I know that it's a defunct currency, but you can figure out how much this would be in today's money, and I guarantee it's something ludicrous. But it needs to cost this much money because it needs to cost this much Helix credits, and the latter is much more important. Making money and getting the most out of customization, which is one of Unity's real big selling points on release, it's just a fucking pain, involving a whole lot of grinding or waiting on your passive income stream, instead of actually just kind of having fun with the game. While we're on the topic of Helix, I think another thing that's worth addressing that often isn't talked about is the Helix Store. Not its existence in a broad sense, but the actual store's interface, pricing, nomenclature, it's all sketchy. For example, it pulls the underhand move of making pricing incredibly awkward to encourage these kind of why not successive purchases. The entire thing from top to bottom feels incredibly manipulative. The creation of a premium currency used to kind of mitigate that awkwardness of spending real dollars is pretty shitty. I forget where I saw this, but I've seen somebody compare it to the way that casinos use chips. You're made to feel more comfortable throwing away real money because, well, it's not real money, right? There's this guise of tokens, which becomes even more questionable once a sort of gambling is introduced. There isn't really any question about it. Premium currency has no place in a $60, $70 single-player AAA game. But unfortunately, the store has recurred in every game following, and has just continued to get worse. Another thing is that Helix credits don't carry over, despite the existence of Ubisoft Club, a service that has a points system where you can use these points to buy in-game items, and those points carry over from game to game. The exclusion of any kind of game-to-game carryover is clearly intentional, as it could be implemented, it would be fair and consumer-friendly to do so, but it would cost profits, of course. Syndicate took things a little bit further, being the first game to lock maps for key side content behind the store, maps that traditionally would be available for purchase in in-game stores. Although that regression exists, I will cut them some slack on Syndicate. Making money in-game is a bit easier, and so there's less reason to buy credits. Although there is a hypocrisy with this game specifically that I just can't quite place a finger on.
When you steal from the rich, it's criminal. But stealing from the poor, that's capitalism.
Ubisoft's decision to pivot towards RPGs was, of course, a cynical and creatively bankrupt one that was surely spurred on in part by the fact that games like Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla are much more conducive with microtransactions than a dense 15-20 hour linear experience. And right off the bat with Origins, there wasn't really a single trope of modern RPGs that went unmonetized. There's of course outfit and weapon customization, but there's also crafting, leveling, skill trees, things that are all made more tedious by the game's absolutely brutal grind are given some kind of relief in the Helix Store. This is also the game where Ubisoft decided to just put every completionist and collector on the fucking poverty line, and I think this is a part of the two worst things that Origins did on this front, especially considering Ubisoft's position as an industry titan. The redefining of season passes is just not season passes, and the introduction of loot boxes into their single player game. In the case of the season pass, that was released for $40 US, including both of the game's expansions and 2 gear packs. The vast majority of gear packs were excluded from the season pass, going for as much as £12 once converted back from Helix credits. That's about $15 US, which I might remind you is enough money to just go and buy all the good games Ubisoft has made in this series anyway. For as shitty as this is for us, you don't need to include all additional gear packs in your $40 season pass. Luckily for Ubisoft, that isn't a rule, it isn't written anywhere, except for their own fucking advertising. I don't think I know of any other single player games that have reappropriated the term season pass like Assassin's Creed. The standard for a season pass in a single player game, roughly, was this smaller purchase that felt mutually beneficial. The publisher gets to make more money from their current game, often reusing objects, systems, and environments to create new content, and then you would pay for said new content. The implication always was that this included all of a game's additional content. By the time you've spent about $100 on a single player experience, you would hope so. This was the promise pretty much from the start. L.A. Noire was one of the first single players to include a season pass, and that provided 7 new, ample missions for $20. It really did feel like a win-win. Ubisoft's approach, however, was to completely do away with this. Season passes haven't been true to their name in a long time, and Syndicate was the first game to really do this, but the content excluded was kind of tertiary. Origins, however, is where that stepped up, with the exclusion of extortionately priced outfit and weapon packs that after spending $100, over €100, you should be, and in a lot of other games, would be entitled to. That's a statement that unfortunately is quite divisive, because consumer standards have eroded ridiculously over the years. If you were to tell, I don't know, like an Oblivion player in 2006 during the whole horse armor debacle that is even a slightly contentious statement, I doubt they'd believe you. And people are very quick to defend these practices with the position that a lot of this excluded content is just cosmetics. First of all, cosmetics do matter to a lot of players. Just because you might not care about aesthetics doesn't mean that they aren't an important part of the experience, because they are, and always have been. Nor does this mean that they should be apart from the Season Pass. All content should mean all content. This is what Season Pass has always meant in a single player context. Secondly, it's outright false. Many of these overpriced packs have significant stat advantages that have a tangible effect on your game. Ultimately, the players who pay more, even after the sale of a full-priced game, a season pass, and additional expansions, get more, which is an abhorrent, backwards practice that absolutely would not stand just a decade ago. On the topic of expansions separate from the season pass, we may as well talk about the series' latest expansion here, The Dawn of Ragnarok. Now, I'm not really annoyed that this DLC wasn't included in the first season pass, necessarily. It was never advertised as such, but the marketing should have made it clear this was coming, and that there would be a second wave of content. If you'd called the season pass a first year pass, or better yet just laid out the scope of your plans, that feels more honest than season pass, which has an entirely different implication. And I have seen people say that you should expect another wave of content because season implies one period of time, but that simply isn't the standard in single player gaming or Assassin's Creed prior to this. I suppose I don't take issue with its exclusion specifically, I take issue mainly with Ubisoft's broader imperative to kind of maximize playtime at the cost of everything else, and Dawn of Ragnarok is another very conspicuous symptom of that. So contrary to the opinion of a lot of people, I don't see this as a case of blatant false advertising, but there is a withholding of information and a use of selective, schemy language that feels scummy and kind of dishonest. Now, the DLC itself is very expensive. It costs more than what season passes used to cost, so it's got to be worth the money, right? No, it's not. It's very short relative to Valhalla's standards, and somehow still manages to feel overdrawn and bloated. It was made solely to capitalize off of Valhalla's assets with no real creative vision or real reason to exist beyond we don't have paid AC content ready for 2022. This DLC is the epitome of the term cash grab and absolutely should have been included in the season pass. There is no justification for such an audacious price tag. I've seen few if any Assassin's Creed fans, even those that like the newer games, consider this to be anything more than a disappointment and a waste of time and money. So now that tangent's done, we can get back to the second terrible thing that Origins introduced. Reda, or Sargon, or whatever the name the avatar of this store loot box dispensary is given. Now luckily for us, Ubisoft made it possible to unlock gear packs without buying Helix credits via the Nomad's Bazaar, a feature that is still used in these games, albeit under a different name. In this store, you can purchase Heka chests, these shiny pseudo loot boxes that cost in-game currency that of course can be bought with real money. The odds of unlocking anything rare or anything you want are of course very slim, and it'd take you so long to grind enough to get anything of significance that you may as well just pay up for the thing you want, because like breaking your spirit and taking your money is, it's like Ubisoft's move. And I've seen people defend these because you can buy them with in-game currency, but when you can buy not just premium currency, but the primary in-game currency with real money, it's pretty clear what this is about. I mean, come on, like a decade ago, these would be either in an in-game store or the reward for something like a shop quest. The only reason that these don't cost Helix credits is because the boat hasn't been pushed out far enough yet. The kid who runs the store, Reda, is in both Origins, set in the classical era, and Valhalla, set in the Middle Ages. And this is never explained, which I think speaks to the tactlessness and the sacrifice of creative integrity that is surrendered to take your money. Assassin's Creed was one of the most diegetic, immersive AAA games ever. Everything from control scheme to HUD to the smallest pieces of lore were justified in universe. And this anachronism that isn't even addressed, as small as it is, encapsulates Ubisoft's never-ending exchange of brand integrity for covetousness. And that was made clearer in the jump to Odyssey, which is where things got, I'd say, as intrusive as microtransactions have ever been in the main game as of today. And I don't think that statement will stand in like 2 years' time. It is getting worse. In the jump from Origins to Odyssey, leveling went from slow to nightmarish. If you want to complete the main story of Odyssey, you're gonna have to spend hours upon hours trawling through repetitive, monotonous side content, which kind of ceases to be side content when you need to spend more time with the side content than with the main story if you'd like to complete the main story. And bear in mind that most side quests and side activities stick to a rigid formula that is rarely diverged from.
I've got a once-in-a-lifetime adventure just for you. Empty?
And while if that doesn't sound fun, then of course you can just buy a 50% XP boost, or the materials for better equipment. You see the problem with time savers, right? To truly hold any appeal, you need to make significant sections of your game unappealing, which Odyssey certainly does. Because of this, the main story has no momentum. It's stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, with a lot more time spent stopping rather than starting. It's like watching a YouTube video that's 80% ad. Well, I mean, we're getting there. Fucking hell, YouTube, calm down. The point is, Odyssey is a very cynically designed game, a game that punishes any kind of eagerness to engage with its main quest, unless of course you would like to buy your way out of the problem. In that case, Ubisoft has no issue putting some wind back in the sails. In addition to this now sluggish progression, leveling is made much less rewarding by the inclusion of auto-leveling. Level scaling is an option typically reserved for New Game Plus. It brings all of your enemies up to your level so you can replay a game with all your gear without your enemies being just complete punching bags. In Odyssey, this is a feature that is turned on at all times by default. So if at level 47 you want to complete a level 40 quest, it's bumped up to your level. What this means is that there's no upside in being a higher level, only downside to being a lower level. You propel towards advancement all of the time, which wouldn't be an issue if advancement was designed to be fun and not lucrative. As much as I think Valhalla monetized itself in a worse way than Odyssey in some departments, this is the most pessimistic and insulting integration yet, and the kind of design philosophy I'm 100% sure the live service is going to incorporate. This is a game that treats you like a dog chasing a car. The promise of something you want is right in front of you all of the time, but if you were allowed to get it, then the entire thing's over, so what's the point in relenting? And this is why I really dislike the don't like it, don't buy it argument. It doesn't work. If you don't like microtransactions and you don't buy them like the majority of players, you're still burdened with a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey that is crafted in their image that will boast less value for money and be less enjoyable for your not buying them. It's unfortunately a platitude that you'll see in pretty much every discourse around microtransactions now. But if you've sustained the kind of brain injury that makes this seem like it's worth $15, it's no surprise that corporate boot would taste like cotton candy. But back on point, that is the issue with such an argument. The minority of players, the whales, are the demographic that Ubisoft focuses on, because naturally, the whales are worth the most. 0.15% of mobile gamers bring in half of free-to-play mobile game profits, and I'd expect that the majority of Ubisoft's huge company-defining microtransaction profits come from a similarly small amount of players. There's this principle in economics and problem-solving called the Pareto principle that proposes that 80% of consequences are a result of 20% of the causes, and that's basically what's at play here. These games are geared to suck the blood out of the buyers, the whales, the 20% or whatever that figure is, it's probably less than that, through microtransactions, while the majority suffer for it with a worse game that has less value for money. And while that does sound counterintuitive to displease more people than not, the minority more than makes up for it in additional purchases. The majority will buy a standard edition most of the time, not even a season pass, while the minority buys special editions, season passes, additional expansions not included in the pass, gear packs, time savers, maps, and so on. And hey, it's not like this strategy is exactly driving those normal players away. For several years now, I've seen people voice their displeasure about the way that these games are monetized, and sometimes these posts pick up real traction, and yet nothing changes because we still buy these games. The same arguments are being had a year, 2 years, 5 years later, and so Ubisoft gets to have their cake and eat it too. When they can keep both the big spenders and the average consumer buying, there's no disincentive to anti-consumer practice, only more capital to reap. And again, this is something that's been cultivated over a number of years. The goalposts have practically crept to this point. Like, if you go back and play Assassin's Creed 2, it's plagued by none of this. The game introduces customization options and an economy that is completely player-friendly, as any single-player game should be. 5 years after that, the in-game store becomes somewhat damaging to the main game, and another 5 years later, the games are being built around post-release monetization. A choice that would be absolutely maligned had these games been released a few years earlier than they were, had standards been different. This is Ubisoft adapting and contributing to a culture that allows for more and more anti-consumerist practice and a praise of the bare minimum from us as consumers. We're at a point where not kneecapping your game to sell a fucking prosthesis is a thing that's celebrated on like a monthly basis. And when I say that there's a vocal disliking for these practices, I do mean that. Last year there was a very big post on the AC subreddit that expressed displeasure about how at that point, just months after release, half of Valhalla's outfits were exclusive to the Helix Store, and it was very well received. It was something like 95% upvoted, and that is a lot. Achieving any kind of common ground in the AC community is a huge deal that is probably indicative of an issue that irritates most players. On the AC subreddit, as an example, you could say you want, I don't know, to be able to jump in the next Assassin's Creed game, and that would spur on a week-long conniption. But Valhalla, the most recent AC game, has a main story that, I will admit, is much more playable than Odyssey if you opt not to buy microtransactions. The leveling system is much more player friendly, the leveling is entirely different, and you could probably play through just the main story without needing to do any side content. And even if you did, said side content is a fair bit better. The issue is that this was supplanted by stretching the main story incredibly thin. Valhalla is plagued by Ubisoft's obsession with playtime. Ubisoft aim to manufacture a false sense of worth by making their products incredibly long, increasing the likelihood that you'll engage with their store. And because of this just interminable length, a lot of narrative beats don't hit quite as hard because you've spent so much time elsewhere that the momentum has just kind of fizzled out. There isn't really a sense of immediacy to some very important plot points that really could do with it. So by the game's midpoint, you've probably hit the game's fairly low skill ceiling and are dying for something to happen. And to the credit of the many developers that worked on Valhalla, some of these arcs are good, really good, but ultimately feel disruptive to the game on a holistic level. And this strategy of maximizing playtime has seemingly worked. It appears that a serious amount of Valhalla's 10-figure profits are made up of microtransaction sales. A few months back, nstav13 from the AC subreddit pointed out that in spite of making $1 billion, Ubisoft hasn't announced Valhalla crossing the 10 million units sold mark, something that they did with both Origins and Odyssey. In addition to that, engagement with expansions seemed to be fairly lackluster, which does point to a large amount of that money coming from the store. Given the insane pricing of the game's add-ons, it wouldn't surprise me if a third or even half of Valhalla's profits were comprised of Helix Store purchases, in part because of Ubisoft's current prerogative of maximizing playtime to maximize perceived value and, by extension, investment. And this strategy isn't conjecture either. Ubisoft have stated this much in their quarterly reports. It is scope that makes them money, specifically through microtransactions. Ubisoft are expressly quantity over quality, which explains the development of a live service Assassin's Creed game, which will undoubtedly be the most cynically put together, anti-consumer, blood-sucking product imaginable. It sucks to say, but there is absolutely no way that we're seeing a dense, linear, actual Assassin's Creed game adherent to the series' identity anytime in the next 5, maybe even 10 years, probably ever. Helix is absolutely essential to Ubisoft's soaring profits, and that's evident in the fact that Assassin's Creed now markets to you in-game. If you boot up Valhalla now, it looks like you've walked into fucking Times Square. I mean, seriously, the fact that title menus, which are often used to establish some kind of theme or aesthetic, are tainted with advertisements for pure tripe. I feel like that's pretty emblematic of where we're at. Just a few months ago, Ubisoft just fucking stopped with any kind of pretension and started dropping full-length trailers mid-game.
He's not happy.
And the saddest thing is, this completely uncaring implementation of monetization that is completely ruinous to these experiences and embedded in the design of these games will one day be for nothing. This September, Ubisoft is going to begin decommissioning the PC versions of several games and DLCs to focus resources on newer products. Space Junkies, an online game released for $40 just 3 years ago, will be defunct in a few weeks. The AC Liberation remaster, which was on sale just days ago as of me recording this, will be defunct in weeks also, as well as access to all single-player DLC from the Ezio trilogy with no refund or any kind of rebate. This obviously should be illegal, but, you know, wanting to own the things you've bought? Well, that's outrageous. Get fucked. I despise you, actually, but not your money. Sorry, your Helix credits. I love those. Happy 15th anniversary, you guys. We'll be celebrating by taking things from you and shutting down our community program for no reason, with no forewarning. I hate to be this much of a downer, and this is hopefully the only video I'll ever make that is this negative, but this destructive industry trend that Ubisoft is forwarding goes beyond the next AC having, I don't know, bad parkour or cloak physics. Their practice is a repulsively anti-consumer one that commands that your dollar is worth less than it was yesterday. It's because of this bleak, corporate-driven monetization that holds you as a consumer in complete contempt that this series will forever be live services and 150-hour RPGs that are desperate to handicap themselves to sell you some kind of remedy. The reason that Assassin's Creed has been a soulless husk of a franchise for so many years now is because complying to the series' identity, even loosely, means abandoning a format and a whale market that is incredibly profitable. Ubisoft have necessitated the creative erosion of their biggest franchise, and that's why I don't believe Assassin's Creed will improve, because Ubisoft won't improve. Their business philosophy demands that they don't. I would go as far as to say that Ubisoft's business philosophy insists that these games atrophy on a creative level. Your $60, $70 buy-in needs to be worth less and less as time goes on, and I dread to think where this series is going to be in just a few years once it's centered primarily around live service. As much as I dislike Valhalla as a comprehensive product, I do appreciate it in some ways as a footnote of the series for me, as I know that it was for a lot of older players. It's certainly not all there, not even close, but with modern day intrigue that has actual continuing connection to the past, with genuine payoff that rewarded years of investment, with some exploration of the philosophy of what will become the Assassins and Templars entwined around a real culture, assassinations with investigations that reward, or at least try to reward, smarter play. There's a lot there that kind of, it is enough for me to say, like, that's it. I've kind of bowed out now and am accepting that the series hasn't been made for me for a long time and will probably stay that way. I'll probably kind of poke my head in every time there's news to see what's going on and maybe do a video on it, but the way this series has devolved creatively and is monetized annoys me more than it's really worth. That's why I put this together, so I can kind of air some withstanding grievances and go back to making content on the stuff that I actually do like talking about. I know that I made a video similar to this back before that big break, but I'm 18. Despite appearances, I am an adult now, and I have adult priorities like being Ubisoft's most passionate hater, and what else have we got here? Let's consult the schedule. Anyway, I think that is everything. I know this was a little bit rambly, but there was a lot to cover, and I didn't really want to miss anything. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you around.